Nick Cannon is coming out with a new CD. It's a CD where he is performing as a white person in something called whiteface. Well, I've talked long enough. To get more into this, we're going to be joined by Professor of Law at the University of Southern California, Jody Armour, to talk about the evolving role of role and who can play what role. Welcome, Jody.
Good to be back with you, Andrew. Yeah, and we are getting right into the question of who can play what role and what it means to play any given role as a member of any given race.
First, let us know what Nick Cannon did, and then tell us if this reversal, given what you said, is it about art? Is it about comedy? Is it about music? Or is it also a political, subtle power statement?
Well, yeah, it could be. I would say I wouldn't give Nick Cannon that much credit, but he to promote an album that's coming out on April 1st, I think that's today, White People Party Music, is the name of the album. And he wanted to assume a character, white skater dude, he called himself, Connor Smallnut. That's the name he gave himself, Connor Smallnut. He's a white skater dude, plaid shirt wearing, has a lot of stereotypical things that we associate with, kind of skater dudes and surfer guys, etc. And he says things like, bro, I got drafted, racial, draft, and he says that one of his favorite characters is Robert Downey Jr. from Tropic Thunder, who, put on blackface himself. And so that was that's kind of been his pitch that, I am Connor Smallnut and I am going to put on whiteface and go through all kinds of stereotypical gestures and make noises that are stereotypically associated with white skaters, dudes, or whites in general. Now, I find it problematic, Andrew, right off the bat. We aren't just even dealing here with whiteface or blackface. We're dealing with Nick Cannon calling himself Connor Smallnut, okay, and going to a feature of the anatomy of people, of ordinary young men and men in general, and saying something about their anatomy that is stereotypical and full of racial implications. It's not just, we're talking about accidents of birth now and immutable characteristics. We're not talking about things that people eat and say. We're talking about these kinds of what are considered socially would be given a negative meaning, having small genitalia. Now, what's objectionable about that is, number one, Nick Cannon, you're taking an immutable characteristic and making something derogatory out of it and taunting people with it. That's the definition of black racism for about 300 years in this country, number one. Number two, you're playing on an ugly, vicious stereotype that actually does more harm to blacks than you might know. Saying that white men have small genitalia and black men are these, big swinging genitalia really might seem flattering from one perspective, but is really harmful in another, because one of the stereotypes that American society has been rooted in for a couple hundred years now is the notion of the super masculine menial black man and the omnipotent administrator white man. We're going to divide these roles. We're going to put you in the field. We're going to bend you over. You're going to do backbreaking work. We'll give you a lot of the physical, assets that come with being a super masculine menial. But the cost of that enlarged opinion, that opinion of your enlarged, private parts is that you have a small cranium. We have the big cranium, you have the big genitalia. We are the omnipotent administrators, you're the super masculine menial. Do you really want to play into that set of stereotypes, Nick Cannon? Do you want to play on that and then call it just harmless whiteface? So that's one problem that shows that he hasn't thought it through, even going in, the difference between immutable characteristics that people are born with, and you shouldn't, make derogatory statements about them on the basis of, especially when they play into super masculine, menial, omnipotent administrator stereotypes that have long historical roots in them, number one. And number two, and we can get into this more, Andrew, because I don't wanna, kind of have a monologue here right now. But number two, it's just not funny, putting on the white face, saying some of the things that you said, and we can get into more. It just doesn't work even at the comedy level. Dave Chappelle did it brilliantly. Richard Pryor, there are others, Eddie Murphy did a wonderful send-up on whiteface in Saturday Night Live back in the day. So it can be done well, it can be done brilliantly, it can be done effectively, but it can also be done in an obtuse way, which is the way I think Nick Cannon did it.
Well, and I'm glad you mentioned comedy, because the first thing that came into my mind when you said Connor Smallnut is sort of a riff on Monty Python. It sounds like just an absurd name that someone's trying to be funny. They're trying to be silly. Now, whether the humor works or not is a different issue. The other question that sort of played in my mind, because I don't know whether this is a comedy musical CD or this is just a musical CD in which you wanted to riff on these particular sounds, was things like Darius Rucker, who decided to forgo Hootie and the Blowfish and move directly into country. And he didn't have to change his persona. He didn't have to change and sort of mock who he was to do white country music. He just did the music he liked. And I want to talk about that balance with you.
That's a brilliant point. I think, what you're saying there is, I'm not going to go for a gimmick. And Nick Cannon even says, and there's a quote that he has when the story first broke, that the reason he went this route is people just seem to be sensitive about race, he says. And so why not use this sensitivity that people have to draw publicity, to create a furor, right? And to have us talking about what he's doing on April 1st and dropping his music. So it's been effective, but it's a stunt. It's an effective stunt, but I worry about people using race either for commercial reasons or even in the classroom as a stunt, Andrew. I have colleagues who I've talked to through the years, not here at SC, some other places I've been, but it could apply to any faculty anywhere, who want to bring racism and gender into the classroom, but don't know what to do with it once it's in there. They don't have any plans. They don't have any, carefully thought out purposes in mind. They just think it'll add excitement. It'll add spice. It'll add flavor to just bring this up, to throw it in there. But when you do that, you can increase the energy in a room by throwing in a cherry bomb or a firecracker or a stick of dynamite. You don't just want to increase the energy in a room. You also want to shed light. You want there to be as much light as heat coming from your symbolic communication and what you're doing with it, the way you're using words and symbols. And so just to say I'm using this racial kind of trope as a gimmick, as a stunt to increase record sales without having thought through in a way Dave Chappelle would, or the way, a good thought, or Lenny Bruce, a good, clear-headed, thoughtful comedian would, without thinking through how I'm going to use it and making sure I'm consistent in my message, and I'm going to put it in, instead of doing all of that, put it in context, instead of doing all that, he just throws it out there as fresh meat, and says things like Connor Smallnut that can't be taken in hardly any other way but a derogatory, offensive way. And it's just for the sake of money. And then to say, I'm just doing like Robert Downey Jr. in Tropic Thunder. Well, when you're saying, because it's one of your favorite characters, well, when you're saying that a former crackhead in blackface straight out of county is your role model, I'm already concerned about the guidance that you're getting on how to use these symbols and how to use them in an appropriate and sensitive way.
And that is a look under America's armor with Professor of Law Jody Armour from the University of Southern California.